What happens when the anchor of European security begins to pull away, and the continent must stare down danger alone? What choices do leaders, citizens, and nations make when the familiar shield of American protection is no longer a guarantee, but a fading memory? These are no longer theoretical questions. They are the urgent reality confronting Europe today, as the tectonic plates of global power shift beneath its feet. Right now, the United States is beginning an unprecedented withdrawal of its forces from Eastern Europe. For more than 70 years, stretching back to the aftermath of the Second World War, American troops have offered a protective shield, especially to nations bordering Russia and Belarus. Their presence was not just a symbol, but a living guarantee, one that allowed Western Europe to flourish, rebuild, and eventually expand eastward after the Cold War. Now, with thousands heading home, a stark reality settles in. Europe must defend itself, or risk being left exposed to dangers both old and new. Germany is responding with a bold move, signaling a shift in both mindset and policy. In the coming weeks, it will deliver its largest ever shipment of armed drones to Lithuania, a deployment that, in scale and symbolism, recalls the Berlin airlift of the late 1940s, when Western powers delivered vital supplies to a besieged city. But this is more than just military aid. It is a declaration that Germany, long criticized for strategic caution, is ready to shoulder new responsibility at NATO's eastern edge. These drones will patrol the skies just miles from Russian and Belarusian territory, a sign that Berlin is prepared to lead and, if necessary, to risk confrontation in defense of the alliance. Yet, on the ground, the situation grows even more complicated and fraught with uncertainty. Amid brutal fighting in Ukraine's eastern regions, where towns like Zaporizhia and Bakhmut have become bywords for devastation, President Vladimir Putin has unexpectedly proposed a ceasefire. Ukrainian leaders and Western officials are wary, their skepticism shaped by history. Is this a genuine olive branch, akin to the armistices that once ended wars? Or is it a clever maneuver to buy time, regroup, and launch new offensives in the coming months? Mistrust runs deep, fueled by memories of past ceasefires shattered by artillery barrages and midnight missile strikes. Even now, as negotiations are proposed, the shelling has not stopped. At the same time, the world's attention is riveted by a historic summit between the presidents of the United States and China, their first face-to-face meeting in more than 6 years. In a scene reminiscent of past Cold War summits, like the Reykjavik meeting between Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev, every word exchanged could tip the scales in the war for Ukraine and reshape the global balance of power. The fate of millions, from Warsaw to Paris to Tbilisi, hinges on these private conversations, where trade, security, and the rules of a new world order are on the table. Europe now stands at a crossroads, not unlike the moment after the fall of the Berlin Wall, when the continent had to envision its future without the shadow of the Iron Curtain. If leaders cannot unite or adapt, the continent could face not just external threats, but internal fractures, political chaos, economic hardship, and the unraveling of the very fabric of society. The stakes could not be higher. Safety, prosperity, and the power to shape their own destiny hang in the balance. As the ground shifts beneath Europe's feet, leaders scramble to respond. Each move, whether a new military deployment, a speech in Parliament, or a policy announced in Brussels, is watched by allies and adversaries alike. The old security order, built on American guarantees and Cold War logic, is crumbling. In its place, a new era is beginning, one filled with risk, uncertainty, and urgent choices. The question is not only what will happen, but who will take the lead. For generations, American troops have stood as a shield on Europe's eastern flank. That chapter is now closing, echoing the withdrawal of British power from Asia in the mid-20th century, when a former empire recognized the limits of its reach. The United States is now drawing down its military presence in Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Slovakia. Across these nations, each with its own memories of Soviet domination, Several thousand American soldiers who once embodied a frontline guarantee against Russian aggression are departing. Nowhere is this more striking than in Romania, where a vital air base will lose more than 1,000 troops, leaving only about 1,000 Americans behind. The departure is carefully managed, but psychological shockwaves run deep. This is not abandonment, but a calculated shift, reminiscent of the so-called East of Suez moment, when Britain refocused its global commitments. Washington's priorities are tilting toward the Indo-Pacific, as the rivalry with China becomes the defining contest of this era. The much-debated pivot to Asia is no longer theory, it is reality. American warships and aircraft now patrol the South China Sea. American diplomats shuttle between Tokyo and Manila, and the focus of military planners is unmistakably shifting eastward. Yet this transformation is uneven and, in some ways, incomplete. As American forces recede from southeastern Europe, Poland is rising as the new linchpin of U.S. military power on the continent. The American commitment to Poland is set to deepen, casting Warsaw as NATO's front line and subtly redrawing the alliance's internal balance of power. Just as West Germany once became the bulwark of Cold War Europe, Poland now finds itself hosting new bases, advanced missile defenses, and, potentially, the permanent stationing of American troops. For Poles, this is both a validation of their strategic importance and a sobering reminder of the risks. These changes are sending tremors through European capitals. France sees opportunity in Washington's retreat, reviving calls for a Europe that stands on its own feet, with armies that answer to Paris, Berlin, and Brussels rather than Washington. President Emmanuel Macron has repeatedly invoked the dream of strategic autonomy, arguing that only a Europe able to defend itself can truly be sovereign. Meanwhile, Germany is acting with new resolve. Berlin has signed deals to arm Lithuania with attack drones, signaling both leadership and a willingness to take risks. The move is controversial at home, where memories of militarism linger, but the urgency of the moment is undeniable. Europe now faces a crossroads not unlike that of the 1930s, when the continent's failure to respond to rising threats led to catastrophe. Either it unites and invests in its security, or it risks slipping into strategic irrelevance. Lives, livelihoods, and the very fabric of society are suddenly at stake, not in some distant future, but in the here and now. For European leaders, rising to the challenge is anything but simple. Old divisions, between North and South, East and West, linger. Doubts about commitment and burden-sharing persist. And deep vulnerabilities, from energy dependence to fragile supply chains, are about to be tested as never before. The unity forged in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine is fragile, tested daily by populist pressures, economic shocks, and the fatigue of a long conflict. As American boots leave the East and new power centers emerge, cracks within Europe threaten to widen. Under the surface, old fears and rivalries are stirring once again. The ghosts of Yalta and Munich, of appeasement and abandonment, haunt the corridors of power. Is European unity strong enough to stand firm against rising threats, or is the continent dangerously divided at the very moment it needs cohesion most? As the United States begins withdrawing troops from Eastern Europe and turns its strategic gaze toward Asia, European leaders are forced to confront a sobering reality. Can Europe truly defend itself without the American security shield? For many, the answer is uncertain, and that uncertainty is growing louder. Belgium's defense minister has bluntly warned that Europe risks underestimating Russian resolve while vastly overestimating its own military might. His warning echoes those of British and French leaders before the Second World War, when overconfidence paved the way for disaster. For the first time in more than 3 decades, NATO is locked in a direct arms race with Russia. The figures are alarming. While European nations have raised their defense budgets, Russia has supercharged its war production, rapidly replenishing its arsenal with new tanks, drones, and missiles. On the battlefield, Moscow appears to be learning and adapting at a speed that puts Europe at a disadvantage. The uncomfortable truth? Russia is moving faster than the continent can coordinate a meaningful response. The lessons of past conflicts, where delay and indecision proved fatal, are not lost on Europe's generals. Unlike the United States, Europe lacks a single military command structure. Each country's army acts according to its own national priorities, timelines, and doctrines. Ambitious plans for joint rapid response units, like the proposed European Defense Force, remain stalled, trapped by competing interests and political hesitation. In a true crisis, this fragmented approach could paralyze Europe's defenses, turning indecision into vulnerability. History offers sobering parallels. In 1940, the lack of coordination among Allied armies contributed to the fall of France. Germany is attempting to break the deadlock. Under its Zeitenwende, or turning point doctrine, Berlin is spending billions to modernize its forces. Its recent mega-contract for thousands of attack drones, intended to reinforce NATO's eastern flank, signals a new seriousness. But skeptics question whether contracts and bold speeches can erase years of underinvestment and political foot-dragging. Will these efforts arrive in time to matter? Or will Europe, like Rome in its twilight, be caught unprepared by new and nimble adversaries? At the heart of Europe's anxiety is Ukraine. On the ground, neither Ukrainian nor Russian forces can secure a decisive victory without sustained Western support. The future of Ukraine, and by extension, Europe's own security, now hinges less on battlefield heroics than on the ability of Europe and its allies to maintain unity, resolve, and supplies. The cracks in Europe's coalition are watched closely in Moscow. Each delay in ammunition shipments, each political squabble, is noted and exploited. The stakes could hardly be higher. Without urgent reforms and genuine cooperation, Europe's security architecture could falter, exposing millions to peril and shaking global confidence in the continent's stability. Economic futures, social cohesion, and the very idea of a strong and influential Europe all hang in the balance. The lessons of Srebrenica and the Balkan Wars, where delayed intervention led to tragedy, are a grim reminder of what is at stake. And as these questions swirl, the diplomatic chessboard stretches far beyond Europe, with new alliances and rivalries forming in capitals from Beijing to Washington. In the Middle East, new pacts between China and Gulf states redraw the map of energy politics. In Africa, Russian mercenaries compete with European missions for influence. The global contest for resources, allies, and technology is accelerating. The next moves on this global chessboard will be decisive. As old alliances shift and new threats emerge, Europe faces choices that will define its future for generations. Just as the Congress of Vienna in the 18th century shaped a century of peace, and the Treaty of Versailles in the 20th century shaped a century of turmoil, today's decisions will echo through history. The world is holding its breath. As the globe's largest economies converge, old rivalries are being rekindled, and daring new proposals are exchanged. At stake is nothing less than the shape of the future. Will leaders choose a precarious peace, or will the world spiral deeper into disorder? All eyes are on a rare scene. For the first time in more than 6 years, United States President Donald Trump and China's Xi Jinping have met face-to-face. Their conversation is fraught with unresolved disputes. Trade sanctions, the status of Taiwan, and the unyielding conflict in Ukraine loom over the table. Despite the historic photo opportunities, expectations are muted. Experts across continents warn that the differences between Washington and Beijing over economic supremacy, regional power, and military posturing run too deep for easy answers. The rituals of diplomacy cannot conceal the hardening lines between these two giants. Just as the summits of the Cold War masked deeper competitions, today's smiles may hide sharper knives. In the midst of these tense negotiations, Russian President Vladimir Putin has made a provocative move. He has announced a temporary ceasefire in Ukraine, a gesture that immediately draws suspicion from Kiev and its backers in the West. Their doubts are well-founded. Similar overtures in years past have ended in disappointment, broken by fresh waves of violence. On the battlefield, the suffering only intensifies. Russian attacks, especially on vital infrastructure, have become more frequent and devastating. For Ukrainians, whether in battered cities or besieged villages, The war feels endless, and each day brings new dangers. The lessons of so-called frozen conflicts, in Georgia, in Moldova, in the Balkans, are not lost on those who fear a drawn-out, unresolved war. Diplomacy, military might, and economic calculations are now hopelessly entangled. Every nation at the table is probing for leverage, testing boundaries, and searching for any sign of weakness. One small misstep could trigger a cascade, pulling more countries, and countless civilians, into the turmoil. What happens here will echo far beyond the conference halls and war rooms. The stakes recall the high-wire diplomacy of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the world held its breath and the fate of millions hung by a thread. For Europe, the crossroads is clear. The continent's fate, and perhaps the world's fragile peace, hangs in the balance. European leaders face daunting questions. Can they forge unity as the United States steps back and Asian influence grows? Will Russia's provocations fracture the West, or spark a new sense of purpose? For millions of ordinary Europeans, these power struggles are not abstract games. They are daily anxieties, shaping hopes and fears about safety, prosperity, and the kind of continent they will inherit tomorrow. Yet these are not just headlines. The reverberations of global maneuvering seep into every corner of European life, transforming economies, straining societies, and shaping the decisions of families from Lisbon to Warsaw. Consider a German factory manager, whose business now depends on fragile supply chains stretching to Vietnam and Taiwan. Or a Polish schoolteacher, reassuring her students as air raid sirens test the nerves of border towns. Or a French retiree, watching news of pension reforms and wondering if the social contract will survive another crisis. Now, as American troops depart and the focus shifts toward Asia, Europe must confront its vulnerabilities head-on. The choices made in the coming weeks will shape not only the continent's security, but the lives of generations to come. The weight of history is palpable, but so is the opportunity for renewal. Across Europe, geopolitics is no longer an abstract game played by distant leaders. It is personal, urgent, and inescapable. Headlines about migration, cartoons, and birth rates are rewriting the daily realities of millions, reshaping futures in real time. Start with the surge in migration. Over the past year, tens of thousands of young Ukrainian men, seeking refuge or dodging conscription, have crossed into Germany and Poland. Their presence has ignited fierce public debate. Some locals worry about scarce resources and cultural identity, fueling resentment and anxiety. These debates echo earlier waves of migration, such as those following the Yugoslav wars or the Syrian civil war, when Europe's commitment to asylum was tested by fear and uncertainty. Populist and far-right parties are quick to capitalize on these fears. They call for slashing benefits to foreigners, demanding that governments tighten support for all refugees and migrants, including Ukrainians fleeing war. As these arguments gain traction, societies fracture, and the once solid political resolve to back Ukraine begins to erode. In countries like Hungary and Italy, anti-immigrant rhetoric has become a potent force, influencing elections and policy far beyond the immediate question of Ukraine. The ripple effects are not confined to Ukraine's borders. In Russia, internal repression grows ever harsher. The Duma now threatens dissenters not just with prison, but with ruined futures, lost pensions, vanished livelihoods, families left in limbo. The message is chilling: resist, and you risk everything you have built. This echoes the darkest days of Soviet rule, when dissent meant exile or worse. Even the innocence of children's media is swept up in the maelstrom. The beloved Russian cartoon Masha and the Bear has become a flashpoint. Critics accuse it of soft propaganda or of nurturing outdated stereotypes. Defenders insist it is harmless fun. What children watch is no longer a simple choice. It is a front in the wider culture wars. Similar debates have erupted over textbooks, language laws, and history curricula across Eastern Europe. Yet behind these noisy struggles, a quieter threat grows: demographic decline. Nobel laureate Claudia Goldin's research reveals a troubling pattern. As women gain new freedoms, but governments fail to provide genuine support, like affordable childcare or real parental leave, Families hesitate to have children. Birth rates drop. The result is shrinking populations and mounting strain on public systems. This is not just a European story. Japan and South Korea, among others, face similar crises, but the consequences for Europe's welfare states are particularly acute. Some countries have found ways to counter this. Sweden and Denmark, for example, offer generous family policies and foster greater gender equality. Their birth rates remain higher, their societies more resilient. But elsewhere in Europe, the picture is bleaker. Aging populations, fewer children, and a dwindling workforce that jeopardizes long-term economic security. The pension systems of Italy and Spain are already under strain. Without bold reforms, the crisis will only deepen. All of this sharpens the stakes. Migration tensions, cultural battles, and the slow crisis of population decline threaten to unravel the social fabric. If solidarity fails, Europe's ability to withstand both internal turmoil and external pressure will be dangerously weakened. The lessons of the interwar period, when economic hardship fueled extremism, should not be forgotten. As Europe faces these converging crises, the question is no longer just about policies. It is about survival, identity, and the future of the continent. What happens next will shape not only European lives, but the global order itself. The urgency is not lost on those who remember the chaos that followed the collapse of Yugoslavia, or the uncertainty that gripped Europe after the 2008 financial crash. Europe stands on the edge of a decision that will echo for generations. Defense, democracy, and the rhythms of daily life all hang in the balance. The question is not abstract. What will you do? With the United States drawing down its troop presence in Eastern Europe and turning its attention toward Asia, a shield that once felt certain now seems to fade. European nations face the daunting reality of protecting their own borders, economies, and social fabric. The comfort of automatic American protection is slipping away, replaced by a mixture of anxiety and possibility. This is not just a matter of military maneuvers. Every major power, China, Russia, and the United States, is rethinking its strategy, each working to bend the European order to its own interests. The consequences are not confined to politicians or generals. They ripple into the lives of millions, touching jobs, personal safety, freedoms, and the strength of communities. So what can be done? History offers lessons and practical steps. First, European nations can accelerate joint procurement and development of defense technologies, pooling resources to overcome fragmentation. The creation of a true European rapid reaction force, complementing, not replacing NATO, would send a powerful signal of resolve. Second, governments can invest in resilience, securing energy supplies, diversifying trade, and bolstering critical infrastructure against cyber and physical attacks. The example of Finland and Sweden, which have built robust civil defense networks, shows what is possible. Third, leaders must confront the demographic challenge with bold policies, affordable childcare, flexible work arrangements, and incentives for families. Societies like France, which introduced generous parental leave and subsidized daycare, have seen measurable improvements in birth rates and workforce participation. Fourth, social cohesion can be strengthened by integrating newcomers into education and the labor market, countering the narratives of division and fear. Germany's apprenticeship programs and Denmark's focus on language learning offer useful models. Passive observation is no longer an option. If Europeans and their allies simply watch events unfold, they risk surrendering their say in the decisions that will shape their destiny. Security, prosperity, and the very core of democratic values are now at stake. The road ahead is unclear, but it is open to those willing to act boldly and think creatively. So, how will you step forward in this uncertain era? Will you champion unity, innovation, and resilience, or let outside forces chart the course? The next choices, some sweeping, some subtle, will decide not only Europe's fate, but its standing in the wider world. The question, of what will Europe do, who will lead, and how will ordinary people respond, is closing. The challenge is immense, but so too is the opportunity. The final answer will be written not just in treaties or speeches, but in the daily acts of millions, shaping a future where Europe stands strong, united, and ready to meet whatever comes next.